The middle game is where most players feel completely lost, but the truth is, that's usually when your opponent starts making the biggest mistakes. First, you develop your minor pieces. But once you're in the middle game, it's all about reading the pawn chain. It tells you which side of the board gives you more space to bring your pieces in and launch an attack. And that's exactly what I'm about to show you. 10 simple rules that even a beginner can use in their very first game, and they'll set you up to win most of the time. And here comes the first rule. Develop your queen while also connecting your rooks. She usually goes to one of 3 key squares, and you just pick whichever one feels safest. We went with this square because if we played queen to e7, the white knight would jump to d5, attacking our queen, and we couldn't even take it because we'd walk right into a fork. So the better move is queen to d7. And with that one simple move, we're already stacking up multiple advantages. This move lines up with the bishop, which might later lead to sacrifice ideas on the king side, and all of that comes from a simple queen move to the 7th rank. But here's a mistake almost everyone makes, and the tricky part is it looks like the right move. It lines up perfectly with everything we've been doing with the queen, but in reality, it hands over the initiative. We'll talk about that in just a second, and once you see why, you'll never fall for this middle game mistake again. Now, imagine your opponent plays bishop to d3. Let me ask you this, is it worth trading bishops or not? If your answer is yes, you'll probably regret it the moment you do. That's because when you trade, you actually help your opponent develop. Their pawn takes over 2 critical central squares, and as black, we lose the chance to place a knight on an advanced outpost, like e5. Plus, you're opening up the f file, which makes it easier for their rook to join the game. In the end, it's clear we gain nothing from that trade, so it's better to avoid it altogether. Instead, we play bishop to b6. This way, if they decide to capture, we still get a kind of indirect development. That's when a piece that wasn't even in the game suddenly becomes active without us needing to move it directly. But don't get too locked into this one idea. If there's a rook move that makes more sense than just leaving it sitting there, then of course, go for it. The key is knowing this concept exists and that you can actually use it as a strategic weapon. Now, if your opponent follows the same logic and brings the queen to d2, what should we do? That's when we bring in the third idea. First, we talked about developing the heavy pieces, the queen and the rooks. The queen is already a little active, so now it's time to activate the rooks, especially the one still stuck in the corner. The kingside rook is already more involved, but the queenside rook hasn't moved yet, so we bring it toward the center. That way, it finally starts to contribute. Because in a lot of games, that rook gets completely forgotten. And right after that, white copies the idea and plays rook to d1. So now, what's the next step? We need to come up with an active plan for the middle game. There's one plan that tricks a lot of players because it lines up perfectly with everything you've seen so far, but in practice, it actually weakens your entire position. I'll show you exactly how that happens in just a minute. But first, there's one key idea you need to understand: how to start creating threats and planning your attack. The problem is, there isn't always a clear path to attack, because pawn structures tend to lock up the position. That makes it hard to break through or create anything direct. So what do you do in a position like that? This is where so many players blow it. They rush the attack, sacrifice too early, and just hand over the initiative, exactly like what happened with the queen earlier. There are 2 classic approaches here. One of them is to sacrifice a piece, like right here on h3, to expose the king. In that case, their king side would be weakened and we could start an attack. But in this specific position, it's not the best idea. We just don't have enough pieces to back it up. Right now, it's only the queen, and white could defend without much trouble. But if the opponent isn't careful, we can bring in reinforcements. For example, playing knight to g4 would make things a lot more difficult for white. From there, we can look for a favorable trade of the dark squared bishops and then place a knight on d4, threatening both the queen and the knight on f3, which is the main defender against mate on h2. But of course, that's a pretty aggressive way to play, involving sacrifices, and you won't always want to go down that path. There are also more solid ways to build up an attack. One of them is to trade pawns in the center. We can think about pushing the pawn to d5 at some point, but not yet, because right now it would lead to a fork. First, it makes sense to trade bishops since their bishop also has influence over the center. Only after that do we push d5 and start creating real threats. At that point, a few pieces get traded, and it might look like all we've done is exchange material without gaining anything concrete. But the truth is, there's no immediate advantage here. What we do gain is open lines, and that alone makes our pieces more active. It sets the stage for something more serious later, like pushing the pawn to e4 and starting to build real pressure on the king side. One question I keep seeing in the comments here on the channel is, how do I attack the right way? Or how do I defend in the middle game without messing up? And the truth is, the answer to both of those questions comes from the exact same place. There's a moment in chess that even higher-rated players fall for. It's when you spot that brilliant move to win the game. But it's exactly in that moment of confidence where the cruelest trap in chess is hiding. And I'm going to show you exactly what kind of move that is, and the one rule you need to follow so you never fall for this fatal mistake again. But before we get there, imagine white trying a sacrifice on h6. You know this move is wrong, but the real question is, how do you punish this kind of play? In rapid online games, this happens all the time, and it's so easy to slip up and lose the game. The rule is simple. To launch a real attack, you need to have more pieces supporting it than your opponent has defending. If you get this idea, it's easy to spot the flaw. Here, we don't need to worry much because there's only one piece attacking. The knight hasn't joined yet, so that single piece won't be enough to deliver mate. So how do we defend? Just bring in another piece, like the queen or the rook, and that alone is enough to hold the position. That way we don't have to retreat, and we certainly don't have to lose. Here, for example, we can use the queen to defend. But there's also the option of bringing another piece into the game, making an active move that helps both in defense and in attack. That's why rook to d6 is the best move. Not only does it bring the rook into the game, it also immediately attacks the queen and forces your opponent to step back. Whenever you see your opponent retreating like that, it usually means you're on the right track. So the queen goes back to h5. So how do we continue here? This is where another key middle game principle comes in. Activate your least active piece. It's always worth spotting which piece is just sitting there and bringing it into play. In this case, the rook on f8 is doing absolutely nothing, so we activate it by swinging it over through e8. Another possibility is to move the king to g7 and use the h-file as a path for the rook, which is even quicker. Meanwhile, the opponent also wants to bring in more pieces and plays rook to e1. At that point, we answer with rook to h8, going straight after the queen. Notice how important it is to always look for active moves. If they try queen to g5 with check, the solution is simple. We bring in the other rook and chase the queen away. And if she drops back to f5, that's when another typical middle game plan comes into play, neutralizing the enemy pieces. The goal here is simple. Eliminate any chance of slipping up. Whenever there's an enemy piece inside your territory, the first thing to do is push it out. And if you really understand and apply this principle, you'll win the majority of your games because it drastically cuts down your chances of making mistakes. This is where a lot of players get excited and try to force an active, logical move. But in practice, it just hands back all the initiative for free. We could go for rook to f6, but the white queen might force a repetition, and we'd end up getting nowhere. A much better idea is to offer a queen trade on e6, since white already gave up material that works in our favor. That way, we eliminate all threats in a single sequence and secure what is essentially a guaranteed advantage. If white avoids the trade, we still accomplish our goal by making the position safer, pushing that piece away. And that leads us to a very common situation. When you feel like you're about to win and you see a brilliant move that looks like it wins the game, you play it without thinking much. And that's exactly when the fatal mistake happens. Take a look at this position. What move would you go for here? You probably thought of queen takes h3, taking advantage of the pin and already threatening mate on the next move. Looks brilliant, right? But your opponent has an even stronger resource that changes everything instantly. Queen takes g6 with check. And in the end, they're the ones winning the game because they take your queen, capture your rook, and end up with a significant material advantage to decide the game. But to avoid all that, there's one more crucial rule we can apply. Let's go back a few moves. Before playing queen takes h3, you need to remember a principle we've already talked about here on the channel. You need to think not only about the move you want to play, but also about your opponent's possible responses, so you don't end up like now where the attack fell apart because of a capture you didn't consider. The most forcing moves to consider in this position are bishop takes f2 or rook takes g2. So let me ask you, which one would you choose? One of these moves wins the game on the spot. Pause the video and try to find the sequence on your own. The correct move is rook takes g2. The opponent's response is forced. After the king captures the rook, we follow up with queen to h3, and right after that, queen to h1, finishing with checkmate. So just to recap, now you understand how to activate your pieces, avoid traps disguised as good ideas, and build attacks in the middle game. But in the end, there's one detail that separates players who win consistently from those who only win when their opponent makes an obvious mistake. And it's not knowing more openings or memorizing more traps. It's being able to calculate clearly, even in the most chaotic positions. It's when you feel like you played well, but then you blundered right when it was time to calculate. To avoid that, there's a simple 4-step method that organizes your thinking and helps you calculate better than 99% of players. Click the video that's showing up on screen right now, otherwise you already know how this ends. A winning position turning into a loss because of something you could have seen. If you watched all the way to this point and learned something new, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.